The vote was already happening when I walked in. I was late, 3 minutes. The VETH delegate was mid-sentence, which meant I had missed approximately nothing, because the VETH delegate had been mid-sentence for the last 40 minutes. He had 11 mouths. He used all of them, at the same time, in overlapping registers that my translator earpiece rendered as a man reading a legal document while also humming and occasionally sighing. The conclave chamber smelled like recycled oxygen and old agreements, and the seats were designed for species whose spines bent sideways. So I had been sitting wrong for 6 hours a day for 3 weeks, and my lower back had opinions about it. I found my seat, 3rd row, observer section. The little placard in front of me said Earth Liaison in 4 galactic scripts, and underneath that, in smaller text, non-voting status. That last part was new. 2 sessions ago it had just said Earth Liaison. Someone had updated the placards and not told me, which was either an administrative oversight or the most passive-aggressive thing the conclave had ever done. And given their track record, I genuinely could not rule out either. My name is Yara Osai. I was 34 years old. I had 2 degrees in interspecies diplomatic law, 1 commendation from the Earth Diplomatic Corps, and a pen I had been carrying since my first posting that had run out of ink 11 months ago, but which I kept anyway because I did my best thinking when I had something to click. I clicked it. The VETH delegate reached his 4th mouth's contribution to the preamble. My earpiece rendered it as. And whereas the patterns of cognitive emotional broadcasting inherent to the subject species have been demonstrated across 17 peer-reviewed galactic studies to produce measurable behavioral deviation in proximal species populations, including but not limited to voluntary self-modification of cultural practice, unsanctioned empathic resonance, and the documented adoption of non-native grieving rituals by species with no biological framework for grief. We therefore submit that the continued galactic presence of the subject species constitutes an ongoing and escalating hazard to the stability of established social and cognitive orders. I wrote 1 word on my notepad: audacity. Then I underlined it. The thing about the galactic conclave was that it had been around for 600 years, and it had developed, in that time, a very precise and well-organized way of making decisions that everyone pretended was neutral and everyone knew was not. There were 47 member species. Each one had a full vote. Each one also had approximately 17 side agreements, trade dependencies, historical obligations, and mutual grievances with every other member. And those invisible weights were what actually moved the tally. The vote you saw on the board was never the vote that mattered. The vote that mattered had happened in corridors and dining halls and encrypted message threads weeks before anyone walked into this chamber. I had known something was coming for 6 weeks. The first sign was the buffet. The conclave provided meals during extended sessions. It was a goodwill gesture, technically. In practice, it was a logistics operation spanning 47 different biologies, and it worked reasonably well. For the first 2 weeks of the preparatory sessions, the human table had included rice, bread, 3 kinds of fruit, and something that tasted like a very committed attempt at lentil soup. Week 3, the lentil soup was gone. Week 4, the fruit. Week 5, rice and bread, and the bread tasted like it had been made by someone who had read a description of bread but never eaten it. Week 6, nothing. There was a placard where the human food used to be. The placard said reserved. Reserved for what? I had asked the catering staff. The catering staff had looked at me with the particular expression that people use when they know something you do not, and have been told not to tell you. I had filed 3 internal inquiries. I had gotten 3 automated acknowledgments. I had started eating protein bars from my bag and thinking very hard about what, exactly, you remove from someone's place at the table before you remove them from the table entirely. The VETH delegate finished his preamble, all 11 mouths closed. The silence was its own kind of loud. The chamber president, a Merit named Counselor Voss, 7 feet tall, skin like polished graphite, posture so correct it made me feel personally ashamed of my spine, called the formal vote. Resolution 7 Omega. Classification of humanity as a class Omega destabilizing species. I had read the resolution 4 times. I knew what class Omega meant. It was a classification that the conclave had used exactly twice in its 600-year history, once for a biological pathogen, once for a weapons system so recursive it rewrote the logic of any computational network it touched. It did not mean expelled. It did not mean sanctioned. It meant illegal, categorically, structurally, the kind of illegal that did not require a crime because the existence itself was the offense. The tally board lit up, species by species the votes registered, green for yes, blue for abstain, red for no. There were 2 reds. Both were small species with close trade ties to Earth and nothing to gain by being brave about it. There were 4 blues. Everything else was green. I watched the final number lock in, 39-2, with 4 abstentions. The chamber president read the result aloud in the 5 official galactic languages, and my earpiece rendered all 5 simultaneously, and they all said the same thing. Earth no longer holds galactic legal personhood. My pen rolled off the desk. I watched it go, all the way across the smooth floor, all the way to the far wall where it hit the baseboard and stopped. I stood up, I walked to the wall, I picked up my pen, I walked back to my seat, I sat down. The chamber was already moving to the next item on the agenda: administrative matters, logistics of enforcement, the timeline for impounding human-registered vessels. The VETH delegate's 9th mouth was already composing something. I opened my diplomatic protocol tablet. I pulled up Form 7C, which was the standard objection filing for member species. Then I looked at the first field. Species registration number. I stared at that field for a long time. Then I opened a new form, Form 7D, which was the objection filing for non-member entities. It had different fields. It asked for organizational affiliation. It asked for legal standing. It asked for the basis of the objection under galactic law. The basis field had a 200-word limit. I started typing. I used 198 of those words. I left 2 words unused because I wanted the conclave's legal processing system to feel the gap. I wanted it to feel the thing I was not saying. I filed the form. The automated response came back in 4 seconds. Your objection has been received and will be reviewed in standard processing order. Current estimated review time, 16 to 20 weeks. I closed the tablet. The chamber was voting on the logistics of my species removal from the galaxy. The VETH delegate's 11th mouth had joined in now. I found 1 more protein bar in my bag. I ate it. It tasted like compressed disappointment with a coating of artificial vanilla. The thing that nobody in that chamber understood, the thing that the 39 species who had just voted to unmake humanity did not understand, had never understood, had perhaps structurally prevented themselves from understanding, was that this was not the first time. Not the first time humans had been told that their existence was a problem. Not the first time someone with more power and a longer memory and a more organized legal framework had looked at what we were and decided it was too much, too loud, too present, too willing to sit next to you at your worst moment and stay there until you forgot you had asked us to leave. We had been here before. Not in space, in the other kinds of places where people get told they do not count. We had been in rooms where the forms had no fields for us. We had been handed placards that said things in small text. We had eaten the protein bars. We had watched the tally boards. And then we had gone home and called our mothers and eaten rice and started reading the fine print. The chamber president called an end to the session. The delegates filed out. The chamber emptied around me until it was just me and the echo of 11 mouths, and the placard in front of me that said Earth Liaison with the non-voting status underneath. I took the placard. I put it in my bag next to the empty protein bar wrapper and the pen with no ink. Then I walked out. My tablet was already buzzing. 23 messages in the time it had taken me to walk from my seat to the corridor. 23 colleagues, superiors, friends, strangers from Earth's diplomatic network, all sending variations of the same thing, all asking what we did now. I did not answer any of them. I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring. Behind her, I could hear the soft sound of a cooking pot and a news feed running at low volume, and the particular ambient noise of a place where someone has been very busy doing something with a great deal of focused intent. I saw, she said before I could speak. The vote passed, I said. I know. 39-2. I know, baby. I stood in the corridor outside the chamber where my species had just been made illegal, and I listened to my mother stir something on a stove very far away, and I thought about the buffet, about the bread that tasted like a description of bread, about the placard that said reserved. They planned this, I said. Of course they did. For weeks at least. Longer, she said. Yara, listen to me, come home. I have objection filings too. I know you do. Come home anyway. Come home and eat something real and then we'll talk about the filings. I started to say something. Then I heard the background noise on her call more clearly. The news feed was not one feed. It was 7, running simultaneously, and the busy ambient noise was not cooking preparation. It was keyboards. Multiple keyboards. Mama, I said, what are you doing? The stirring sound stopped. What I've been doing for 6 weeks, she said. The line was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Yara, we've been illegal before, we're good at this. 4 words. I didn't ask which time. I didn't need to. She was 71 years old with a bad knee and the particular calm of someone who has already done the math and is now waiting for everyone else to catch up. I looked back at the chamber door. Somewhere in there, 39 species were writing up the logistics of erasing us. My tablet had 41 messages now. I turned around and started walking toward the transit bay. My pen was in my hand, out of ink. I clicked it anyway. There was a lot of work to do. The messages did not stop. By the time I reached the transit bay, they numbered 67. By the time I boarded the shuttle back to the human residential block, they were past 100. I stopped reading them somewhere around message 40 when I noticed a pattern. The first 20 or so were panic, pure and simple, the kind of messages people send when the floor drops out and they need to feel that someone else knows the floor has dropped out. But after that, around message 22 or 23, something changed. They stopped asking what we did now. They started telling me. Message 22 was from a man named Owen Birch, a trade law specialist out of the Geneva office, who I had met exactly once at a conference 3 years ago. He had sent me a 7-point brief outlining the procedural vulnerabilities in the Conclave's resolution under the 7th Expansion Treaty, a document so old that most galactic legal systems had stopped cross-referencing it, because the species who originally drafted it had evolved past the need for written language and nobody had officially retired the treaty, which meant it was still, technically, active. Message 23 was a list, 43 items, every active legal framework under which a non-member entity could challenge a Class Omega designation. 17 of those frameworks were ones I had never heard of. The message was from someone named Clara Holt. No title, no affiliation listed. Just a name and a note at the bottom that said, "These are the ones they forgot about." Message 38 was a contact list, 340 names, organized by posting location. Every human diplomat, liaison, trade representative, and observer currently stationed across 12 systems. And next to each name, a status tag. Most of them said, ready. I sat with that word for the entire shuttle ride back. Ready, not panicking, not fleeing. Ready, like they had been sitting somewhere with their coats on, watching the clock, waiting for someone to open the door. My mother had said 6 weeks. She had been doing something for 6 weeks. I had been filing internal inquiries about catering and getting automated responses, and she had been running keyboards. The shuttle docked. I walked into the human residential block, which was technically a guest wing of the conclave's administrative complex, and which had, in the past 3 hours, been transformed from a quiet hallway of closed doors into something that hummed with the specific energy of people who have run out of patience and found it clarifying. Doors were open. People were moving between rooms. Someone had set up a screen in the common area that was running 6 feeds simultaneously. A woman I recognized from the trade delegation was on a call, speaking very quietly and very precisely to someone I could not see, her hand moving across a tablet in fast strokes like she was annotating something as she spoke. A man named George Adler from the Earth Legal Division intercepted me before I reached my room. George was 48, methodical, the kind of person who color-coded his files and had opinions about citation format. He was also, right now, holding a stack of physical printouts, which meant things had gotten serious enough that he did not trust digital records. "You filed Form 7D, he said. "In the chamber, yes. We need to escalate it. 7D is a holding action. What we actually need is a 7D with a linked 22F, a species coalition endorsement, and a formal standing argument under the 7th Expansion Treaty." He paused. "Clara Holt already started the standing argument. She's in room 12. I did not know who Clara Holt was 40 minutes ago. Now she was apparently already writing the document that I had not yet figured out we needed. "Who is she?" I asked. "Retired," George said. 40 years out of the Corps. She's been following the preparatory sessions from Titan." "Titan?" "She has friends there." He handed me the top printout. "She also has a memory like a filing cabinet. She found the 7th Expansion Treaty citation in about 9 minutes. I looked at the printout. Clara Holt's standing argument was 4 pages long, dense with cross-references, and written in a tone that was precise without being cold. It read like someone who had been waiting a long time to write it and wanted to get every word right. I walked to room 12. Clara Holt was 73 years old, small, white-haired, with the posture of someone who had spent decades in formal chambers and the expression of someone who had long since stopped being impressed by them. She was sitting at a folding table with 3 tablets arranged in a semicircle in front of her, eating crackers from a small bag, and dictating corrections to a younger woman who was transcribing them in real time. She looked up when I walked in. "Yara Osai," she said. It was not a question. She had been expecting me. "Sit down. You look like you haven't eaten a real meal in a week." 6 days, I said. "They pulled the food in week 3, she said. "I know, we were watching the session logs." She pushed the cracker bag toward me. "They were not subtle. That was either arrogance or a message." "Both," I said. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Yes, probably both." She picked up one of the tablets and turned it toward me. "Look at this." On the screen was a chart. Not a legal document, not a brief. A chart with a timeline running across the top and a set of color-coded lines tracking activity across galactic legal archives. "Someone has been pulling archival access records," she said. "Specifically, access to treaties and frameworks from the 1st and 2nd expansion periods, old documents, things that most member species stopped consulting when the Conclave reformatted its legal index in year 340. She tapped the screen. "Access spiked 6 weeks ago, not from Conclave internal systems, from independent research terminals." "Human terminals," I said. "Across 9 systems," she said. "Yes." I stared at the chart. 9 systems. Dozens of people, maybe more, pulling up documents that the rest of the galaxy had quietly set aside, because the rest of the galaxy had been here for 600 years and had accumulated the quiet confidence of institutions that assume their way of doing things has already accounted for every edge case. They had not accounted for us, not the way we actually were. They had modeled us as a destabilizing biological force, an unregulated emotional pathogen, a species that made other species do things they would not otherwise do. They wrote that into their resolution as a condemnation. They did not appear to understand that they had just described our greatest skill. My tablet buzzed. I looked at the screen. It was a notification from the Conclave's legal processing system. Current objection filing queue. Standard processing order, 16 to 20 weeks. And then, below that, an updated figure I had not seen before. Total active objection filings received in the past 2 hours, 341. I counted 340 human representatives across 12 systems, 1 filing each. Plus mine. 341. Filed simultaneously, in the 2 hours since the vote, under 17 different legal frameworks, including frameworks that the Conclave's legal processing system had not been asked to cross-reference in over a century and therefore had not, apparently, pre-indexed for rapid processing. The system was not designed for this. It was designed for the occasional formal objection from a member species, filed through established channels, moving through a process that everyone understood and that moved at the pace of an institution that had never needed to hurry. It was not designed for 341 simultaneous filings under 17 frameworks, several of which required the system to go and find the relevant legal architecture in archives that had not been digitally indexed in their current format. "How long does this back things up?" I asked. Clara Holt allowed herself a small smile. The last time the Conclave's legal processing system went into formal backlog was year 347, she said, during the second merit boundary dispute. "How long did that take to resolve?" 8 months, she said, and that was 17 filings. I did the math. She let me do it. She sat there eating her crackers and let me work out what 341 filings across 17 frameworks, filed by a species that had just spent 6 weeks reading documents the galaxy had forgotten it owned, was about to do to the most powerful legal institution in the known world. It was not going to stop the resolution, not immediately, not with 39 votes behind it and 600 years of institutional weight. But it was going to slow it down, and slowing it down meant time. And time was the one thing the Conclave had not factored into its model of how humanity would respond to being made illegal. They had expected grief, or anger, or negotiation. They had not expected the fine print. My tablet buzzed again. This time it was a call request. The name on the screen made me stop. "Mama." I answered it. She was at a table somewhere I did not recognize, a cargo hub by the look of the background, functional and industrial, with other people moving behind her. She had a bowl of rice in front of her and a screen to her left, and the particular expression she got when she had been working for hours and was nowhere close to done. "You got to Clara," she said. "You know Clara Holt." "I got her number from Owen Birch 3 years ago," she said, "after the Conclave's second preparatory review, the one that produced the restricted species proposal that didn't pass." She picked up her spoon. I kept it. Of course she had. She had a bad knee and opinions about tea, and she had kept the number of a retired diplomat for 3 years because she thought she might need it someday. "You knew," I said. "Baby." She looked at me through the screen. The background noise behind her was keyboards again, multiple keyboards, and now I could also hear voices running through what sounded like a structured briefing. "We've been illegal before. We're good at this." How many people are working from that location? She looked around, counted. Right now, 14. We have 8 more coming in the morning shift. Mama, that's a coordination cell. Yes, she said. You've been running a coordination cell. I prefer to think of it as a reading group that got motivated, she said. Behind her, one of the voices asked something about the 7th Expansion Treaty citation, and someone else answered with a document reference number from memory, and 2 people started cross-talking about procedural standing, and my mother sat in the middle of it eating rice with the calm of someone who lit a fire 6 weeks ago and has been feeding it since. I pressed my fingers against my eyes. I thought about the buffet, the bread that tasted like a description of bread, the placard that said reserved. I thought about 39 species who had built a legal mechanism to remove us from the galaxy, and who had apparently not once considered that we had been reading their rulebook. Not as a side project, not as a desperate last measure, as a reflex, as the thing humans do when someone points at the door and says you do not belong here. We read the sign on the door. We read the code the sign was posted under. We find the paragraph that the sign forgot to account for, and then we sit very quietly with that paragraph and we wait. Come home, my mother said. I can't yet. We have filing work to do here. I know, I meant come home eventually. She looked at me with the steady look that I had spent my entire childhood trying to read and never fully decoding. You're not done yet, but you will be. And then you come home, and I make rice, and you sleep in your old room, and we talk about what comes next. The call ended. I put my tablet down on Clara Holt's folding table. Outside, through the open door of room 12, I could hear the common area still humming, still moving. Someone had put new feeds up on the screen. The Conclave's legal processing system had, according to one of the feeds, issued its first formal backlog notice in nearly 7 centuries. Current processing delay for new filings, estimated 14 months. 14 months. The galaxy had tried to write us out of existence, and instead found itself buried in paperwork. George Adler appeared in the doorway holding a new printout. We have a response from the Merit Trade Delegation, he said. He looked like he was trying not to smile and not fully succeeding. Good response or bad response? I asked. They want to file a supporting brief. Clara Holt set down her crackers. The Merit, she said, in a tone that suggested this was not nothing. Yes, George said. The Merit, she said again, do not file supporting briefs. They do not voluntarily enter disputes that do not directly affect their trade standing. They have not done so in 300 years. There's a note attached, George said. He looked at the printout. It references a medical posting, 4 years apparently, on their homeworld, a human doctor. He paused. It says the brief will cite trade agreements in the formal filing, but the note says, tell them we remember. The room was quiet. Clara Holt picked up her crackers again. She ate one. She looked at the ceiling. 14 months, she said, and the Merit. Yes, I said. Well, she looked back at her tablets. We'd better write something worth their signature. I pulled up a chair. George handed me the printout. Outside, the common area hummed and the feeds ran, and somewhere 100 light years away my mother was eating rice at a table full of people who had decided, 6 weeks ago, that the galaxy had misread the situation. The audacity, I thought, was structural. The enforcement began on a Thursday, which felt deliberate. Thursdays have a quality of established routine, of normal procedure, and the Conclave had clearly decided that impounding human ships and quarantining human colonies should feel like administration rather than action. Routine paperwork, a process moving through its scheduled steps. The first ship was a cargo vessel named the Kepler Line 7, registered out of Ganymede, 3-person crew, mid-run between a trade station in the Dravathi Outer System and a fuel depot near the Merit boundary. The Conclave's enforcement division intercepted it with a standard hailing frequency and a document package, and the crew, according to the report that reached me, responded by asking if they could finish their delivery first, and when the enforcement officer said no, they asked if they could at least use the bathroom. They were allowed to use the bathroom. They were not allowed to finish the delivery. 43 more vessels were impounded in the first 72 hours. The crews were processed, documented, and transferred to holding facilities that the Conclave called transition zones, which was a name so deliberately administrative that it almost succeeded in describing nothing at all. Almost. I was in Clara's room when the first colony status update came through. 17 human colonies across 4 systems had received quarantine notifications. The notifications were polite. They used words like restriction and movement limitation and temporary measure. They did not use the word quarantine, but that was what they were, and everyone reading them understood this. And the politeness of the language sat on top of the meaning the way the catering placard had sat on top of the empty space where our food used to be. I filed 4 new objection documents before lunch. Clara filed 11. George filed 8 and also, somehow, found time to put together a cross-reference index of all active Conclave enforcement actions against the relevant treaty frameworks, color-coded by priority level. I did not ask when he slept. I was not sure he did. What I was watching and could not fully name yet was a kind of structural test. The Conclave was an institution built on member consensus and the assumption that its definitions held. The definition of personhood, the definition of species standing, the definition of what counted as a legal entity with rights versus what counted as a classification, a hazard, a thing to be managed. It had passed those definitions into law 37 days ago. And now the law was moving, and the world was responding. Not the way the Conclave had modeled. The first sign came from the Merit. Their brief arrived formally on day 4 of enforcement, and it was, as Clara had predicted, a document of extraordinary precision. The Merit were contractualists by culture and by cognitive architecture. They did not, as a species, operate on sentiment. They had a word in their primary language that translated approximately to emotional noise, and they used it to describe the entire category of decisions made on the basis of feeling rather than calculated interest. They considered it a deficiency, a kind of cognitive static. The brief cited 17 trade agreements. It cited the 7th Expansion Treaty. It cited 3 Port Authority codes from the first conclave period that nobody had invoked in living memory. It was, on its surface, a masterwork of the kind of legal argument that the Merit considered the only valid form of reasoning. And then in Appendix C, at the bottom of 22 pages of trade law, there was one paragraph. It was not legally binding. Clara said so when she read it. George nodded. I read it 3 times. It said, the Merit delegation acknowledges that this brief proceeds from contractual obligation. It also acknowledges, in the interest of full disclosure, a matter of historic record. During the culling plague of year 419, a human physician named Dr. Adiz Nwasu accepted a voluntary posting to the Merit homeworld and remained for 4 years without contractual compensation. The relevant record is not presented as legal argument. It is presented as context. Appendix C is not legally binding. They filed it anyway. I did not say anything for a while after reading it. Clara did not say anything either. George made a small sound that was not quite a word and looked at his color-coded index as if he needed a moment to be somewhere organized and comprehensible. The thing about the Merit, the thing that made Appendix C mean something beyond its non-binding status, was that they were not a species that disclosed context. Context that was not legally relevant was, by their framework, noise. The fact that they wrote it down, formatted it, attached it to a formal brief, and submitted it to the most powerful legal body in the known galaxy meant that something had shifted in their internal calculation. something that their framework should not have allowed. And they had done it precisely because it was not legally binding, because it was the one thing they could do that existed entirely outside the space of interest and obligation and trade standing, the one thing that was purely, uncomplicatedly, a choice. The merit, a species that had not voluntarily entered an extra-contractual dispute in 300 years, had chosen. I called my mother and told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Adiz Nwasu, God of small mercies, I remember that name." "You knew her?" "I knew of her. She's gone now years ago, but I knew people who worked with her." She paused. She never talked about the merit posting, not publicly, said it wasn't her story to tell. She spent 4 years. She stayed because they needed her to stay. That's how she was. My mother's voice had a particular quality when she talked about people she considered to have done something right. Not admiration exactly, recognition. She would have found Appendix C funny. "Or obvious," I said. "Or obvious," my mother agreed. On day 6, the Dravathi abstained. Not just from the Enforcement Coordination Committee, from the broader discussion, from the entire procedural track. The Dravathi had not abstained from a conclave vote in 300 years. They were not a disruptive species. They did not make dramatic gestures. They were agricultural, deeply communal, oriented around long, slow cycles of decision-making that their neighbors had sometimes mistaken for passivity. They were not passive. They were patient in a way that the conclave, built on the compressed decision cycles of spacefaring species, had consistently misread. Their abstention came with no statement, no brief, no appendix. It came with a message, direct, personal, encrypted. "Sent to me." I read it in the common area with George on one side and Clara on the other, both pretending to look at their own screens. The message said, "We remember the year your people stayed. We remember the harvest songs. We do not move quickly, but we do not forget." I read it twice. I did not look up for a while. "Dravathi?" George asked. "Yes." Clara set down her crackers. "Tell me." I told them about the message. I told them what I had found when I looked up the year, the colony ship with the failed engine, the 9 months on a Dravathi agricultural world, the singing at the harvest, the children, the songs that stayed after the humans left. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The conclave modeled us as a pathogen." "Yes." They called it emotional contagion, unsanctioned empathic resonance. She picked up a cracker, looked at it, put it down. They were describing what happens when you sit with someone through something hard and they don't forget. "They thought it was contamination," I said. "Of course they did," she said. "From a certain angle it looks exactly like contamination. You arrive, you stay, you sing at the harvest, you name the grief. You teach the children a call and response they've never had words for before. And then you leave and those things remain and the species that had them cannot unhave them." She looked at me. "The galaxy has been telling us that's a problem for a long time. They finally put it in writing. They thought making it illegal would stop it." "It already happened," she said. 300 years ago on a Dravathi farm world. 400 years ago on the Merit homeworld. You cannot pass a resolution against something that is already woven into the fabric of where you live. Outside, the enforcement operation was moving forward. More ships, more colonies. The conclave was doing what it had voted to do, efficiently and procedurally and without malice, the way institutions do things when they have decided that the deciding is done, and now it is only a matter of execution. But the gallery was shifting. On day 8, 2 more species abstained from the Enforcement Coordination Committee, not from public statements, not from dramatic exits. They simply stopped showing up to certain votes. They cited procedural concerns, scheduling conflicts, the need for internal review. The conclave's legal processing backlog had reached 16 months. New filings from human legal teams were arriving at a rate that the system's intake process was visibly struggling with, not because of the volume alone, but because the frameworks being cited required the system to retrieve and cross-reference documents that were not in its active index. It had to go into archive, into the old records, into the documents from a time when the galaxy was younger and the rules had not yet settled into the shape that everyone had agreed to treat as natural. The rules were not natural. They had been written. And the things that get written can be answered by other things that were written if you know where to look and if you have been reading. I stayed late in Clara's room on day 9, going through a set of records that George had flagged. Old trade route documentation from the first expansion period, not relevant to our current filing strategy, not directly useful for anything. I was reading them because I needed to understand what we had built out there, across all those years, in all those places where we had stopped and stayed and sung at harvests and sat with people through the hard parts. I needed to understand it not as sentiment, not as the thing the conclave called emotional contagion, as what it actually was. It was the record of every time a human had been somewhere difficult and chosen to stay anyway. Every time we had sat down at a table where we were not quite wanted and learned the language well enough to make someone laugh. Every time we had named something that didn't have a name yet in the local vocabulary and left that word behind when we moved on. The conclave had called it a destabilizing force. They were not wrong about what it was. They were wrong about what it meant. Clara looked up from her tablet sometime after midnight. The VETH delegation requested a closed session, she said, for tomorrow morning. About what? The agenda says procedural review. She paused. 3 weeks ago that would have meant nothing. Now it means they're worried. Good, I said. She looked at me with the particular expression she had when she was recalibrating something. You've changed in 9 days, she said. I've been reading, I said. It shows, she reached for a cracker. The closed session means they're counting again, recounting, checking their numbers. She chewed thoughtfully. 22 abstentions last tally from the enforcement committee. Last session it was 3. Yes. She said it the way you say a number that you are still getting used to. The way you say something that hasn't fully arrived yet but is clearly on its way. 22 species who had not broken with conclave consensus in decades. 22 species that had, in the past 9 days, quietly declined to be part of the enforcement mechanism. Not publicly, not dramatically. Just stopped showing up to certain votes. Just started asking for more time to review. Just started, apparently, remembering things. I looked at the message from the Drevathi again. We remember the harvest songs. We do not move quickly, but we do not forget. The conclave had built a wall to keep humanity out. They had built it carefully, with 39 votes and 600 years of procedural weight behind it. They had not modeled what the wall would do to everyone who was standing on the other side of it and had, at some point, eaten dinner with us. I closed my tablet. I ate the last cracker from Clara's bag. I looked at the clock. Tomorrow there would be more filings, more frameworks to cross-reference, more documents pulled up from archives the galaxy had quietly stopped looking at. But tonight I just sat with the number. 22. And the number was still moving. The station was called Waypoint Null. That was its official designation in the conclave's navigation registry, from a period when it served as a transfer point for the Outer Route Mapping Survey, a use that ended approximately 280 years ago when a boundary treaty renegotiation accidentally left the station's jurisdiction unassigned. Nobody corrected the filing. Nobody decommissioned the station either. It sat in the gap between 3 overlapping territorial claims, technically part of none of them, drawing power from a solar relay that continued to function, because it was automated and nobody had told it to stop. The Human Diplomatic Corps found it on day 11. An archivist named Peter Ackafer, who had been systematically going through every piece of conclave boundary documentation that predated the current registration format, noticed the jurisdictional gap while cross-referencing enforcement zone maps with station registries. He flagged it at 2 in the morning in a message to George Adler that said, "Found something you should see," and attached 40 pages of documentation. George called me at 3 in the morning. He sounded like a man who had not slept but had just had a cup of very good coffee and an idea. "We can use it," he said. "The station. Legally, the current enforcement jurisdiction doesn't extend to it because the jurisdiction never got formally assigned to any treaty framework that contains the Class Omega enforcement provisions. The conclave can challenge it, but it would take time," I said. "Months," he said, "at minimum, probably longer given the current backlog." "How functional is the station?" There was a pause that told me he had already looked this up. Life support operational, power stable, communication relays functional. It's been sitting there running for 280 years doing nothing. I was quiet for a moment. I thought about the protein bars. I thought about Clara's crackers. I thought about a station that had been waiting in a jurisdictional gap for almost 3 centuries because nobody had gotten around to filing the right paperwork. "Get Peter to document the jurisdictional argument fully," I said. "I want it airtight before we move anyone there." "Already started," George said. 48 hours later, I was standing in Waypoint Null for the first time. It smelled like recycled air and old arguments, which I was beginning to understand was the smell of every place where humans had decided to dig in and work. The corridors were narrow. The lights ran at about 80%. The common area had furniture that was designed for 3 different species, and none of them human, which meant we had spent the first morning rearranging everything into configurations that were slightly wrong in different ways and collectively more tolerable. Clara Holt arrived on the second shuttle with 17 printed documents, a bag of crackers, and Peter Ackafer, who was 31, very quiet, and apparently capable of finding jurisdictional gaps in ancient treaty documents the way other people find loose change in a sofa. George brought the filing archive. He also brought a color printer, which he set up in the room that had become our working space, and which he proceeded to use extensively. By the end of the first week at Waypoint Null, we had 43 people working across 4 rooms in a common area. Human legal specialists, former diplomats, 2 people who had been retired for over a decade and returned specifically for this, 1 linguist whose official role was translation support, and who was also, it turned out, an expert in archival conclave procedure, because she had written her academic thesis on it 20 years ago and never entirely stopped thinking about it. Her name was Ruth Dale. She was 53, British, precise in a way that felt physical, and she had found 3 treaty clauses in her first 4 days that none of the rest of us had known existed. The third one made Clara Holt set down her crackers and stare at the ceiling for a full minute before she spoke. "This is the argument," Clara said. "This is the foundational argument." Ruth had her hands folded on the table and the expression of someone who had known that for a while. "Yes," she said. The clause was from the Conclave's founding charter, pre-expansion, the language that predated everything the Conclave had built itself into. It said, in the translation Ruth had worked through across 2 days, "No designation of legal status may proceed from a species-specific judgment, as a species-specific judgment cannot constitute universal law without the consent of the entity whose status is being determined." I read it twice. "They violated their own founding charter," I said. "The resolution was passed under the current framework," Ruth said, "which does not directly reference the founding charter because the founding charter predates the current framework by 400 years, and the assumption was that the current framework superseded it." "Assumption," Clara said. "Yes," Ruth said. "Assumption, not formal supersession. There was never a vote to formally retire the founding charter. It was simply set aside." Like the Seventh Expansion Treaty, I said. Like several things, Ruth said. The conclave is 600 years old. It has accumulated a great deal of foundational language that it has, over time, quietly stopped reading. Because nothing ever needed it, I said. Until now, Ruth said. I looked at the clause on the screen. I thought about 39 species and a vote and a placard that said reserved. I thought about Clara finding 3 treaty clauses in 4 days. I thought about Peter Ackhafer at 2 in the morning, finding a jurisdictional gap that had been sitting there for 280 years, running on automated power, waiting to be found. The conclave had built its resolution on the assumption that the rules were settled, that the architecture of galactic law was fixed and mapped, and that every relevant clause had been accounted for. They had not been reading the old rooms. We had. On day 19 at Waypoint Null, the abstention count from the Enforcement Committee reached 22. I was in the middle of a working session with George and Ruth when the notification came through, and George showed it to me on his tablet, and I stopped talking for a moment. Last session it had been 3. Then 9, then 15, now 22. The movement was quiet. None of the abstaining species were making statements. None of them were staging walkouts or filing counter-resolutions. They were simply, in the slow and deliberate way that institutions move when something in the foundation has shifted, declining to be part of the mechanism. The VETH had called 2 more closed sessions. The chamber president had issued a procedural statement that was careful and measured, and which, if you read between its lines, was asking everyone to hold their positions while the numbers were re-examined. The numbers were not holding. I knew I was not the right person for what was coming. I knew this the way you know things about yourself that you have not yet had to act on. I was a mid-rank liaison who had watched a pen roll across a chamber floor and decided to pick it up. I was not a great orator. I was not a political figure. I had never in my career sought visibility, and I was constitutively unsuited to the kind of performance that formal conclave proceedings required. Clara knew it too. She did not say it. She showed it to me sideways, the way she did with most things, by talking about something else. The founding charter argument requires a speaker, she said one evening, when the station had gone quiet and most people had gone to sleep. Someone with standing in the chamber, someone the coalition will name. The Marek Coalition, I said. They'll name a human speaker, she said. It needs to be a human, symbolically and legally. Who? She looked at me. No, I said. The coalition asked specifically, she said. They reviewed the filing record. They know who has been running the legal strategy from here. She picked up a cracker and then put it down without eating it, which was how I knew she was serious. They also know about the founding charter argument. They want the person who found it. Ruth found it. Ruth found the clause. You understood what it meant. She looked at me steadily. Yara, the speech isn't a performance. It doesn't need to be brilliant. It needs to be true. Those are different things. I did not answer. I looked at the clause on my screen. No designation of legal status may proceed from a species-specific judgment. One sentence, 400 years old, written by people who were trying to prevent exactly this and had no way of knowing it would matter 400 years later, so they wrote it down and left it there. Writing things down and leaving them for someone to find. That was not a new idea for us. My mother called that night, not late, early evening. Behind her the cargo hub was still active, though quieter than it had been in the first weeks. She had coffee this time, not rice, which meant she had been going for a long time and had passed the rice stage and entered the coffee stage. The coalition brief went through, she said. The formal submission, 14 co-signatories. I saw. 14, she said again. Yara, when the conclave first voted to expand membership 200 years ago, they got 11 co-signatories for a vote that fundamentally rewrote the composition of galactic governance. We have 14 for a founding charter challenge filed by a species that was made illegal 6 weeks ago, I said. Structurally impossible, most people would have said. Most people hadn't read the old documents. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. That's what we do, she said. We read the things other people put down, we pick up what they left, we carry it. She drank her coffee. You know what I keep thinking about? What? The Dravathi harvest songs. That human colony, 9 months on an agricultural world because their engine failed. Completely unplanned. No diplomatic agenda. No treaty objective. Just people stuck somewhere and they helped with the harvest and they sang. And 300 years later it's in the abstention count, I said. Not because anyone planned it, she said. Because they were just themselves, because that's what we do when we end up somewhere. We show up, we help, we sing. She set down her cup. The conclave looked at that and called it contagion. They weren't wrong about what it was. They were wrong about everything else. I'm going to speak at the final session, I said. She was quiet for a moment, not surprised, just absorbing it the way she absorbed most things. I know, she said. Clara thinks. Clara is right, she said, and you know she's right or you wouldn't have said it like that. I was quiet. Right, okay, fine, she said, the way she said it when a decision was made and what remained was just the doing of it. Then come home after. After, I said, yes. I'll make rice. The line went quiet. I sat in the narrow corridor of Waypoint Null with the recycled air and old argument smell, and the station running its automated functions all around me. 280 years of patient waiting. And I thought about what you write down when you are trying to prevent something from happening, and you have no way of knowing if anyone will find it. You write the truest thing you can. You leave it there. You trust that someone will come, eventually, who needs exactly that word. I pulled up my documents. I started with the founding charter clause. I started reading. The session was in 4 days. I had a lot of work to do. I did not give the speech I wrote. The speech I wrote was good. I want to be honest about that because there is a version of this story where I stand up and deliver something I worked on for 4 days and it changes the galaxy. But that is not the story. The story is that I stood in the bathroom of Waypoint Null at 5 in the morning before the transit shuttle came and looked at myself in the mirror above the station's scratched metal sink and had a direct conversation with myself about whether I was actually prepared for this. My conclusion was that I was not. That I was a person who picked up pens off floors and read old documents at 2 in the morning and ate crackers from other people's bags. That I was not a great speaker or a heroic figure, that I had 2 degrees and 1 commendation, and a pen with no ink that I was still carrying because I did my best thinking when I had something to click. Then I thought, what the conclave built their resolution on was the assumption that we should have been someone else, quieter, less present, less prone to sitting down at tables where we were not wanted and learning the language. Less likely to stay through the hard parts and sing at the harvest and name the grief and leave something behind that did not belong to us and could not be taken back. They had looked at all of that and called it a problem. The speech I wrote was the speech of someone trying to answer that charge brilliantly. The speech I needed to give was something else. I put the written speech in my bag. I got on the shuttle. I clicked my pen the entire flight. The conclave chamber was the same as it had always been, same recycled air, same sideways chairs that hurt my spine, same placard in the observer section that said Earth Liaison. I did not go to the observer section. I went to the floor. The coalition had filed the necessary credentials. I had standing to speak. It was a strange feeling, standing in the place where the vote had happened, on the floor instead of behind the railing. The chamber president, Councillor Voss, called the session to order. The agenda was read in 5 languages. My earpiece translated all 5. They all said the same thing. Formal response hearing, Founding Charter Challenge 7D22, Human Coalition Petition. The VETH delegate's first mouth opened. I was ready for 40 minutes. I had brought water. The 40 minutes passed. Then the VETH's second procedural motion. Then the formal reading of the challenge summary by the coalition's merit lead, which was precise and thorough, and which I listened to with the particular feeling of watching someone else accurately describe the thing you spent 4 weeks building. The merit counselor read it without inflection, which was how they read everything, but Appendix C of their brief was in the formal record, and the chamber knew it was there. Then Counselor Voss called on the human speaker. I stood up. The chamber was larger from the floor than from the observer section. I had not expected that. I stood with my notes in my hand and my pen in my other hand, and I looked at 47 species arranged in a chamber that had been making decisions about the galaxy for 600 years, and I thought about what Clara had said. The speech is not a performance. It needs to be true. I put my notes on the table in front of me. I did not look at them. I want to talk about a catering change, I said. The chamber did not visibly react. That was the conclave's particular skill. 47 species in one room, and the collective response to an unexpected opening was a wall of disciplined stillness. But I had been in this chamber for weeks, and I had learned to read it, and what I felt was not stillness. What I felt was attention. 3 weeks before the vote on Resolution 7 Omega, I said, the human catering table at the preparatory session stopped providing food that humans could eat. It happened in stages. First the hot food, then the fruit, then the bread, eventually just a placard that said reserved. I paused. I filed 3 internal inquiries about it. I got 3 automated acknowledgments. I ate protein bars from my bag, and I thought about what it means when someone removes your place at the table before they remove you from the table. I let that sit for a moment. I am here today under a founding charter clause that is 400 years old, I said. I want to be clear about what that means. It does not mean we found a loophole. It means the people who built this institution 400 years ago tried to prevent what this chamber did 6 weeks ago. They wrote down what they believed and left it there and trusted that someone would find it when it was needed. We found it. I looked at the chamber. We found it because that is what we do. We read the old rooms. We pick up what got left behind. We carry it. I talked for 11 minutes, not the speech I wrote, the true one. I talked about Adis Nwasu and 4 years on the Merit homeworld, and a brief with an appendix that was not legally binding, and that the Merit had written anyway because they had something to disclose, and they chose to disclose it. I talked about a colony ship with a failed engine and 9 months on a Drevathi farm world and harvest songs that were still being sung 300 years later. I talked about a station called Waypoint Null, sitting in a jurisdictional gap for 280 years, running on automated power, waiting. I talked about the catering table, about the placard, about what it means to be told in small procedural increments that you do not count. The founding charter says no designation of legal status may proceed from a species-specific judgment, I said. This is not a technicality. This is the foundational principle of what this institution claims to be. You cannot define us out of existence using a framework that excludes us from its own definition. You cannot make us illegal using laws that require our consent to be universal. I paused. You called what we do contamination, emotional contagion, unsanctioned empathic resonance. I let those words sit in the air. You were describing what happens when you sit with someone through the hard parts and they remember. You were describing what happens when you stay long enough to learn the harvest songs. You were describing what happens when you write a paragraph that has no legal force and file it anyway because you have something to say and you want the record to show that you said it. I looked at the Merit delegation. Appendix C is not legally binding, I said. They filed it anyway. That is the only definition of solidarity I have ever needed. The VETH delegate tried to invoke procedural override. I knew he would. I had read the procedural rules carefully enough to know that a coalition-endorsed speaker had certain protections during formal challenge hearings. I also knew the room was going to respond before I did. 29 species voted to let me finish. I finished. The vote took 4 hours. I sat in the chamber for all of them. Clara was in the gallery. George was in the gallery. Peter HFY and Ruth Dale and my mother, on a screen feed from the cargo hub on Titan where it was the middle of the night, and she was sitting at the table with her coffee and 22 other people who had been running keyboards for 6 weeks. The chamber president read the tally. Resolution 7 Omega, suspended pending full constitutional review. Not overturned. I want to be precise about that. Suspended, sent back into process. The challenge had bought time and forced review and forced the chamber to confront the founding charter argument in open session with 14 coalition species watching. It had not won. It had made winning possible. Those are different things and both of them matter. I sat with the word suspended for a long time. George sent me a message that was just the number 31. 31 abstentions in the final procedural committee vote. I had last counted 22. The number was still moving. Clara sent me a message that said, "Eat something." I realized I had not eaten since the crackers on the shuttle, and it was now 7 in the evening, and I was sitting in an increasingly empty chamber, because most of the delegates had moved to the corridor for post-session discussion, which was where most of the actual work of the conclave always happened anyway, in the corridors, in the informal spaces, in the places where the formal record was not running. I stayed in my seat for a while. The chamber emptied around me. The lights shifted into the lower setting they used after sessions ended. The placards were still on the tables. Mine still said Earth Liaison with the small text underneath it. I looked at it. I picked it up, put it in my bag with the pen. In the corridor outside, the merit counselor was speaking with 2 other delegates. She saw me pass. She did not stop her conversation, but she made a particular gesture with her primary hand, a motion I did not recognize at first and then did from the treaty documentation I had been reading. It was an old merit form, pre-expansion. It meant, the record has been noted. I made the closest human approximation I could manage. I hoped it was close enough. I walked through the conclave complex for the last time that evening, through corridors that I had walked for 6 weeks, past rooms where decisions had been made and unmade and suspended and challenged, past the chamber where a pen had rolled off my desk, past the catering bay where a placard had said reserved. Someone had put the human food back, not a full selection, a bowl of rice and some bread that actually tasted like bread. I did not know who had done it or when. I took a plate of rice and ate it standing up in the corridor, and it was the best thing I had tasted in 6 weeks. Outside the conclave complex, the transit bay was running its last shuttle of the evening. I got on it. A Dravathi delegate was seated at the back of the shuttle in the wide section designed for their build, which was tall and broad and not designed for narrow shuttle corridors, but they had managed. There were 2 of them. I recognized one from the abstention committee records. They looked at me. One of them hummed something, just a few notes, low and rhythmic. I did not know the melody, but I recognized the structure, the call and response shape of it, the space left open at the end, waiting. I hummed back, something approximating the answer, probably wrong, probably the accent of someone who learned it from a 300-year-old record instead of from living with it. The Dravathi delegate looked at me for a moment. Then they made a sound that I thought might be the equivalent of a smile. Then they looked back out the window. The shuttle lifted. Waypoint Null was a 2-hour transit from the conclave complex. When I got there, the station was warm and lit and loud with the sound of people who had been watching a feed and were now talking all at once. George was standing in the middle of it holding a printout and trying to explain something to 3 people simultaneously. Peter HFY was at a screen with Ruth Dale, already pulling up something new, already looking for the next old room, the next document left behind, the next clause that had been waiting to be found. Clara Holt was in the kitchen area eating crackers and looking entirely unsurprised by everything. I sat down next to her. Someone put a cup of something hot in front of me. The common area was full of people who had spent 6 weeks reading fine print and had just watched something shift, and they were not celebrating exactly, because suspended was not victory, but they were making the noise of people who understood that something real had happened, and that the number was still moving, and that there was more work to do, and they were here to do it. My tablet buzzed. "Mama." I answered it before it buzzed twice. "I saw," she said. "I know. You didn't use the speech." "No." She was quiet for a moment. I could hear the cargo hub behind her, quieter now, people winding down. "You ate," she said. "Rice, actually, from the Conclave catering bay. They put it back. Someone did." She made that sound again, the one between a laugh and something else. "Come home," she said. "Soon," I said. "There's still work." "I know. Come home when there's less of it." "I'll eat rice." "I'll make extra," she said. The call ended. Around me, Waypoint Null hummed and clicked and ran its automated functions with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time and was used to it. The common area lights were warm. George was still explaining something to 3 people. Peter had found something in the archives, and Ruth was already annotating it. Through the narrow window above the kitchen area, I could see a small piece of the star field, just a corner. Enough. The founding charter had said no designation of legal status may proceed from a species-specific judgment. 400 years ago, written by people who were trying to prevent this, left there for someone to find. We found it, we read the old rooms, we picked up what got left behind. We were still here. The number was still moving. I clicked my pen. It was still out of ink. I held it anyway, and I looked out the small window at the stars, and I thought about harvest songs and Appendix C, and a catering placard, and a Dravathi hum on a transit shuttle, and all the things you can leave in the world by simply showing up and staying and being entirely, stubbornly, unapologetically yourself. The galaxy had tried to write that out. We wrote back. That was all it ever was. That was all it needed to be. I picked up my tablet. I opened the filing queue. There were 37 new documents waiting for review, and the Founding Charter Challenge was moving into its formal review track. And somewhere in the archives there were more old rooms with more old words in them, and I was very good at finding them. I started reading.